This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitahone, and today I'm continuing with my limited set review for Alchemy Horizons Baldur's Gate. Yesterday I covered all of the multicolored cards in the set, and today we're looking at white, and tomorrow we'll look at blue, and so forth. For each of these cards, I'll give you my thoughts on the card, then sum up those thoughts with a letter grade. If you're not sure what the letter grades mean, you'll find an explanation in the description. As always, keep in mind in this video, I'm only giving my predictions for how good I think these cards will be in the limited formats, and that means I'm not talking about any other ways to play Magic. Also, because I haven't actually played with some of these cards, most of them, really, I am definitely going to be wrong about some of them. As we start playing the format, I'll give updates on my thoughts in my Need to Notes series, which comes out every Saturday. Alright, let's dive in with our first white card from Alchemy Horizons Baldur's Gate. First, it's Boresker Tollkeeper, which for one generic and a white is a 3/1 Orc Knight at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, target opponent reveals all creature and land cards in their hand. Choose one of them. That card perpetually gains. This permanent enters the battlefield tapped. So, as this is a digital-only set, we're seeing some digital-only mechanics like perpetually, which means that that card for the remainder of the game has that line of text, regardless of where the card goes. If it goes into the graveyard and they bring it back, still has that line of text and so forth. So this is a nice little 2-drop that makes your opponent's life a little bit more difficult, and it pairs well with the blue-white deck in the format, which can abuse Enter the Battlefield abilities. It is pretty sweet that you can even make lands enter tapped. It's not quite land destruction, but it's going to feel kind of like that sometimes. I think the trigger here is actually going to give you enough tempo that I think this is a nice 2-drop. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Champions of Tyr, which for 2 generic and 2 white is a 4/3 Angel Knight at Mythic Rare. It's got flying, it has double team, and when it enters the battlefield, you get a boon with, when you cast your next creature spell, that creature enters the battlefield with your choice of a +1/+1 counter, a flying counter, or a lifelink counter on it. This is another card that has a couple of digital-only mechanics. One of them is exclusive to this set in Double Team. That means that when this creature attacks, you add a copy of it to your hand, and then both copies lose Double Team. And the whole boon thing here, it really just means that it's sort of a temporary effect that is visible on the battlefield. That means the next time you cast something, when you meet some requirement, you get an effect. In this case, the next creature you cast will give you a +1/+1 counter, a flying counter, or a lifelink counter on it, and then the boon is gone. So this is insanely strong. It has great stats as a base, as a 4-mana 4/3 flyer, and the Enter the Battlefield ability substantially upgrades the next creature you cast one way or another. If that's all this card was and you completely took away Double Team, it would be an A. But this gets extra spicy because it also has Double Team itself, which means you get another 4/3 flyer and that Enter the Battlefield trigger again, and because it can fly, getting that second copy isn't going to be that hard. In fact, the copy you cast might be the card that gets upgraded. I think in the end, this is an A+. Next up, it's Flaming Fist Duskguard, which for 1 generic and a white is a 3/1 Dwarf Soldier at common. When it enters the battlefield, you get a boon with, when you cast your next creature spell, it perpetually gets +1/+0. The boon you get here isn't the most exciting thing in the world, but it's stapled to a reasonable creature in a 2-mana 3/1, which is always a decent aggressive stat line. This seems like a bread and butter type 2-drop for white decks. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Mace of Disruption, which for 1 generic and a white is a common artifact equipment. The equipped creature gets +0/+2 and has protection from demons and devils, and whenever equipped creature attacks, it perpetually gets +1/+0 if it has the same name as another creature you control or a creature card in your graveyard, and it has an equipped cost of 1. This doesn't seem very good. The idea here is that you have duplicates created by Double Team, for example, and while that is going to happen, the fact that the perpetual +1/+0 is so conditional doesn't make me that interested in this. I think it'll still be too hard to make the perpetual part happen, and if you're paying 2 mana for an equip 1 equipment that only gives +0/+2 and protection from 2 creature types, you don't really want to be playing that. So I think this is probably just a D. Next up, it's Moradin's Disciples, which for 3 generic and a white is a 2/3 Dwarf Cleric at uncommon. It's got double team, and when it attacks, you tap target creature defending player controls. So we've seen a lot of creatures, white creatures in formats that when they attack, tap something down, and they're always quite good because they really enable you to have way more impressive attacks. And in this particular case, it'll also mean that it'll be easier for you to trigger double team and have the creature survive. And then once you have two of these attacking together, your opponent's basically never blocking again. The stat line is mediocre for sure, but this is still a powerful 2-for-1, so I don't care too much. I think this is a B-. Next up, it's Patriarch's Humiliation, which for 1 white is a common instant, and it says target creature perpetually loses all abilities, then Patriarch's Humiliation deals damage to it equal to the number of creatures you control. So a 1-mana instant that does damage to a creature equal to the number of creatures you have in play is a card we've seen before, and it's usually like a C. It can be really efficient removal, but it requires enough setup that it isn't really premium. This adds the creature loses all ability text to the mix though, which means that you can get a bonus effect that keeps that creature from ever having abilities again, which can matter sometimes. And it also means that even in a situation where you can't quite kill a creature, this can still do something. Unlike most versions of this effect where you top deck it and it's useless if you have no creatures, this can do something. Usually it's not going to be worth a full card, but it's better than not being able to use the card at all. Obviously, you need to be killing things with it for it to be worth a slot in your deck, and basically the fail case is a little less awful than usual. I think this is a C+. Next up, we've got Ranger Squadron, which for 4 generic and 2 white is a 3/4 cat ranger at common with flying and double team. So take double team away from this card and it is not very good. The stats just aren't good here, but this is a double team creature with flying, and that means you're pretty likely to get that second copy while also keeping this alive. And yeah, it's 2 copies of an inefficient creature, but we've seen in many limited formats that any sort of effect that gives you card advantage tends to be good, even if that extra card you're getting isn't actually efficient. And I think that's what we're seeing here. I think this is a C. Next up, we've got Sea Tower Imprisonment, which for 2 generic and 2 white is an uncommon enchantment aura. It says enchant creature or planeswalker you don't control. When it enters the battlefield, you conjure a card named Soldiers of the Watch onto the battlefield. Enchanted permanent can't attack or block, and its activated abilities can't be activated. So another digital only mechanic here, Conjure, that is sort of like making a creature token, but the thing that's created is actually a full card. So like if it gets bounced to your hand, you get the card in your hand unlike you would with a token. And Soldiers of the Watch is 1 generic and 1 white mana for a 2/1 with double team. It's actually the next card we'll look at here in a second. So yeah, this looks really impressive as a removal spell. It will compare pretty favorably with Sleep with the Fishes from the last set. It shuts down the creature almost entirely and gives you a 2 mana 2/1 with double team on the battlefield. That's definitely worth 4 mana, and this is definitely premium removal. Now, there is a sacrifice theme in this set, which can make a card like this a little worse, but you get to hold on to your creature even if that goes down, so you're never really losing a full card worth of value, even if your opponent finds a way to ignore Sea Tower Imprisonment. I'm giving it a B+. There are a few cards that might also reach this level of power. This is an especially powerful set, so we'll see if it really comes out as the best uncommon by the end. So next up, it's Soldiers of the Watch, the card we just heard you conjure a copy of. So that means you don't have to have Soldiers of the Watch in your deck or anything, by the way. You don't have to have this card to make that removal spell make the 2/1. It just appears out of nowhere because we're talking a digital-only mechanic. And anyway, Soldiers of the Watch is 1 generic and a white for a 2/1 human soldier at common with double team. It's hard for most of these double team creatures to be anything lower than like a C. This is because they all have serious 2-for-1 potential, and even this fairly underwhelming creature will give you 2 bodies often enough that I think it's probably a C+. Like the idea of playing this on turn 2 and then just attacking with it on turn 3 in a situation where the best your opponent can do is trade seems really good, and that's going to come up a lot. And, you know, 2 power is enough that this can actually attack on a lot of boards. There will be times where you can't ever really get the double team part going, but you still have a 2 mana 2/1 as your fail case, so seems pretty good to me, especially for a common, and it seems even crazier that this is stapled to that removal spell we just saw. Next up, it's Soon's Intervention, which for 4 generic and 2 white is a rare instant, and it says choose 1 or more. Create 2 2/2 white knight creature tokens, seek a non-land permanent card with mana value 3 or less, destroy target artifact, destroy target enchantment, and target player gains 3 life. So Seek, another digital only mechanic. This means that you get a random card from your deck that meets this requirement, in this case, non-land permanent. So one will just show up in your hand that's a non-land permanent card with mana value 3 or less. So this is really strong. In Limited, you'll basically always be able to gain 3 life, make 2 night tokens, and seek a cheap non-land permanent, and that is definitely worth the 6 mana you're paying. Basically, it's a 2-for-1 with bonus life gain thrown in, so the times where you can also blow up an artifact or an enchantment or both will feel pretty insane. It's also an instant, so you can ambush your opponent with the 2/2/2s. You can blow up equipment or an aura that's on one of your opponent's creatures at instant speed. I think this is a bomb. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Sworn to the Legion, which for 4 generic and 2 white is a mythic rare enchantment, and when it enters the battlefield, non-token creatures you control perpetually gain double team, and whenever you cast a creature spell, it perpetually gains double team. So this gives double team to all your stuff. This means you can actually chain double team together. Even if you play a creature that you got from double team, it will gain it again when you cast it, so it just keeps going. That is undoubtedly powerful, and this will give you some significant value. There is a big problem here though, and that's that this 6 mana enchantment won't really have an immediate impact on the board. Yeah, your things gain double team, and sometimes that will make you more willing to attack, but if your creatures were already pretty medium, this isn't going to help you out very much. So you kind of have to have the right creatures already, or this just won't matter, and the whole turn you take to cast this can really mean you're going to lose the game. If you untap and you have more creatures to play, it's going to feel good. Like in those situations, it's going to feel really good, but there are just so many situations where this just won't do enough, and I think that probably means it's just a C. Next up, it's Valiant Farewell, which for 1 generic and a white is a common instant, and it says target creature you control gets +2/+0 until end of turn. When that creature leaves the battlefield this turn, you get a boon with, when you cast your next creature spell, it perpetually gets +2/+0, draw a card. This seems like a decent combat trick. I don't love that it costs 2 mana and only offers +2/+0 to your creature, because without a toughness boost, that means your creature's chances of surviving combat are significantly lower. But this does replace itself, and it also offers a permanent boost to your next creature, and that value certainly helps this card out. It still means in a lot of situations you use this up as a trick on your creature. You use it on your creature probably also dies in combat but kills their thing, and sometimes that's not going to feel great, but I do think the card you draw and the +2/+0 you get stapled to your next creature is enough for this to be a solid combat trick in aggro decks. I think it makes it a C. Next up, it's Vladimir and Godfrey, which for 2 generic and a white is a 3/2 legendary zombie knight at rare, and you can pay 2 generic and return it from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped, and it perpetually gets +1/+1, activate only if you control a 1/1 creature. This looks pretty good. Sure, a 3 mana 3/2 isn't great, but the fact that you can bring them back later in the game is pretty amazing. Obviously, your deck will need some 1/1s to make them worth it, but even just having 3 or 4 1/1s will make this card worth running in Limited, because, you can play one in the later game and then get Vladimir and Godfrey back. It seems like this is going to give you pretty amazing value, even without you trying that hard. I'm giving it a B. Next, it's Ancient Gold Dragon, which for 5 generic and 2 white is a 7/10 Elder Dragon at Mythic Rare. It's got flying, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you roll a d20. You create a number of 1/1 blue fairy dragon creature tokens with flying equal to the result. So D20 is a returning mechanic from Forgotten Realms. Basically, on Arena, all it means is a random number is generated between 1 and 20, and you get, in this case, a number of dragon tokens equal to the number you roll. So 7 mana is a lot, but what you get for that investment here is pretty crazy, since as soon as it hits your opponent, it's going to build, usually, a massive army. I mean, sometimes you'll roll a 1, I guess, but even when you're only rolling a 1, you get a 1/1 blue fairy dragon creature token that can block right away in your opponent's turn, and the times where you roll like 5 or more are just going to be completely absurd, and probability says that's usually what's going to happen. So the one downside this card has is that you do need to untap and still be able to attack with it on your next turn. But as soon as you do that once, you're probably not going to lose the game. And overall, I think that makes this a bomb, giving it an A. Next up, it's Archivist of Ogma, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/2 halfling cleric at rare. It's got flash, and when an opponent searches their library, you gain 1 life and draw a card. So a 2 mana 2/2 with flash is usually a decent card. It can ambush and kill X2s or 1/2s and things like that. And this one comes with a pretty nice hate bear type effect. Drawing a card is big, so getting to do it when your opponent searches their library for any reason is pretty nice. Now, You shouldn't expect it to happen a lot. In your typical limited game, there won't be much searching going on. This format doesn't have like Evolving Wilds or, like the lands we just had in Capenna that people are searching their library all the time. We don't have those things really going on. And then Seek is a mechanic that doesn't technically search the library. So, there aren't that many effects that can trigger this, but you have a decent chance of actually getting this to do the thing like once over the course of your draft. And because it's already on a really good card, I think that makes this pretty good. Well, not really good, but a solid card. I think that makes this a C+ overall. Next up, it's Ascend from Avernus, which for X and 3 white is a rare sorcery, and it says return all creature and planeswalker cards with mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Exile Ascend from Avernus. This seems a little too costly and a little too difficult to set up to be worth it. I mean, imagine paying 6 mana and you get like 2 things back. I think that might be kind of optimistic, and that's probably not worth it. Yeah, if you pump a ton of mana into it, then maybe you're doing something. But this card suffers from the fact that none of the white decks in the format are really graveyard decks. Black-white, it gets the closest to being one, but it still isn't that big of a theme. If this format had like some sort of white deck that could quickly load its graveyard, I would be more interested in this, but this format just doesn't have that, and I think this is probably just an F. Next up, it's Blessed Hippogriff, which for 3 generic into white is a 2/3 Hippogriff at common, and adventures are back. This one comes with Tyr's Blessing, which for 1 white mana is an instant adventure. Target creature gains indestructible until end of turn for 1 mana. And then when you cast Blessed Hippogriff, it's a 2/3 with flying, and when it attacks target attacking creature without flying, gains flying until end of turn. So if you haven't played with adventures before, what it means is you can cast this as an instant, in this case, as this Tyr's Blessing, then the card gets exiled and you can cast it later as a creature. You don't have to have the creature adventure before you can cast it though, so it's not like a requirement to cast it to pay that 1 white mana, it's just a bonus that you can do with this card. So I think if you just stripped the adventure away from this card, you'd have a C+. Reasonably costed flyers that send another flyer or another creature into the air always play quite well. The adventure part of the card isn't always going to matter, but it is nice that if you find a way to use it ahead of turn 4, you can get some pretty real value, and sometimes even a 2-for-1. Like if you just block their 2/2 with your 2/2 and you use this, that's going to feel pretty amazing because then you get a whole card out of it later. And even just setting up a chump block that your creature survives is pretty decent, a nice way to use the card, since you get that whole creature later. So I think having this adventure does enough to push this Hippogriff into the lower B range. That means I think you can first pick it in some weaker packs, and you should probably value it pretty highly if you're in a white deck. Now, the indestructible part, I think that's something people always overrate in limited because that keyword is so strong, but it is pretty situational, so keep that in mind. But what makes this a good use of it is that the Hippogriff itself isn't situational, it's just a good creature, so you can use it as a spell earlier if you have the opportunity. Next up, it's Celestial Unicorn, which for 2 generic into white is a 3/2 unicorn at common, and whenever you gain life, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. So this is a Forgotten Realms reprint. There are several in the set, and it was a solid little life gain payoff last time. I think that's what it will be this time. It goes especially well in green-white as a result. It was never super impressive or the payoff you were really counting on to go wild with that deck, but you definitely played it every time you were in the life gain deck, and you were never really sad about it. I think it's a C. Next up, it's Dawnbringer Cleric, which for 1 generic and a white is a 1/3 human cleric at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you have 3 options. You can gain 2 life, you can destroy an enchantment, or you can exile a card from a graveyard. So this is another reprint from Forgotten Realms. It was an okay 2-drop. If you're in the life gain deck, it gives you a little bit of extra value because gaining 2 life has some more real meaning in that deck, and then the fact that it can blow up an enchantment or hate on the graveyard also gives it some additional utility. Still, the 3 effects are underpowered enough and not useful often enough that this is a card you always play in every white deck, and I think that makes it a C-. Next up, it's Flaming Fist Officer, which for 2 generic and a white is a 2/2 gnome soldier at common, and whenever another creature you control leaves the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on Flaming Fist Officer. So this starts as a Grey Ogre, and that's always a pretty awful stat line, mostly because plenty of 1-mana cards can deal with this 3-mana card. But this does get bigger. It likes it when creatures go away, whether they die or get blinked, and that means it will be useful in decks like black-white and blue-white. Still, it probably isn't the payoff that makes either of those decks good. It's just sort of a decent payoff that you play in the deck. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Guardian Naga, which for 5 generic and 2 white is a 5/6 Naga at common. It comes with an adventure. In its case, it is Banishing Coils, which for 2 generic and a white is an instant adventure. Exile target artifact or enchantment. And when it's a creature, it has Vigilance, and as long as it's your turn, you prevent all damage that would be dealt to it. So, you know, neither half of this card would be very good on their own. The adventure is an expensive version of Disenchant, and the creature has pretty underwhelming stats for the cost, even with Vigilance and its ability to not take damage during your turn. This is another one that has sort of a situational adventure that you won't always have something to use it on, but it's pretty nice that you can run this in your main deck and have a way to hate on problem artifacts or enchantments without trying very hard. And after all, you do get a 2-for-1 out of this card if you do find a target for that first half. And I think overall that makes this a C. It's probably a little better out of the sideboard where you know the first half has targets and you know you'll get the 2-for-1, but it seems solid in general. Next up, it's Guiding Bolt, which for 2 generic and a white is an uncommon instant, and it says destroy target creature with power 4 or greater, scry 2. We see this effect a lot, and it's usually worth playing one of in your main deck, though not terribly exciting. Most decks have targets for a removal spell like this, but not usually so many that you can look at this as premium, even with scry 2 attached. Still, I think the first copy should be valued reasonably highly. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, we've got Horn of Valhalla, which for 1 generic and a white is a rare artifact equipment, and it has an adventure. Eastguard's Call in this case, X generic and 2 white for a sorcery, and you create X 1/1 white soldier creature tokens. And the Horn of Valhalla itself is an equipment where equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each creature you control, and it has an equip cost of 3. So this one, when you look at it, if you just took away the equipment side of the card, it would be pretty nice. Getting multiple bodies out of one card is always nice. And sure, playing this early for 1 or 2 mana isn't great, but it does scale all game long. You can make a bunch of bodies to protect you or pressure your opponent, and the equipment side would also be a pretty decent card on its own too. At worst, it gives +1/+1, and sure, sometimes it will feel clunky when that's all it's giving you, but in the end, you have 2 cards that would be playable on their own, and a little better than playable, really. I think they're both, C+, B- level cards. You have those stapled together, and they synergize with one another too. Neither side is the most efficient thing in the world, but I think this does just enough to get into the lower bomb range. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Icewind Stalwart, which for 3 generic and a white is a 3/3 tiefling warrior at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you exile up to 1 target non-warrior creature you control, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. Hill Giant stats are, like Grey Ogre stats, not something that I love, and I'm not sure the Enter the Battlefield ability here does enough for this to be great. It does something, because a 4 mana 3/3 that's vanilla would be like a D-, and I think this is probably a C-. And yeah, I mean, there are things you can use this on in this format, but I think you'll find yourself in enough situations where the Enter the Battlefield ability just doesn't do anything that it makes it a lot harder to be interested in. Next up, it's Lae'zel's Acrobatics, which for 3 generic and a white is a rare instant. It says exile all non-token creatures you control, then roll a d20. Return those creatures to the battlefield under their owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. That's what happens if you roll a 1 through 9. And if you roll a 10 through 20, you return those cards to the battlefield under their owner's control, then exile them again. Return those cards to the battlefield under their owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So this is another card that is all in on abusing Enter the Battlefield abilities that I'm not super pumped about. Sure, you can use this to save a creature from removal and stuff like that too, but there will be times where it just doesn't make sense because you also need to be able to block when your opponent attacks you. You can, of course, set up blocks and then use it, and sometimes your opponent will try to use removal, or they'll try to use a combat trick, and you can do this in response, in which case it feels pretty good. The value will be pretty nice, but I still feel like this is asking for far too much to actually be worth it on a regular basis. You just need the right situation, and it has a high ceiling when you have that situation. The blue-white deck in the format does want to abuse Enter the Battlefield abilities, but these cards that almost only are there to use those abilities over and over again aren't great. Like, I need these cards to be doing something else to have a fail case that actually matters often enough that I want to play them, and I don't think this quite does it. I mean, it does have a high enough ceiling in the right deck that I want to give it a C, but it's honestly probably not even that good in most decks. Next up, it's Minimus Containment, which for 2 generic and a white is an enchantment aura with enchant non-land permanent, and the enchanted permanent is a treasure. So this is another Forgotten Realms reprint. It's decent removal. Being able to deal with any permanent type is nice. But it never really felt premium since you are giving your opponent back some pretty real value, especially when you use it early and it can ramp them into more powerful spells. So it's better to hold on to this and use it late. That's when it feels like it's at its best, but that also means the card is a little more limited than it might look at first. I'm giving it a C+. Next, it's Monk of the Open Hand, which is a 1-mana 1/1 elf monk at uncommon, and whenever you cast your second spell each turn, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. This is another Forgotten Realms reprint. It was a decent 1-drop in the format. Getting the counter on it was a little easier than I expected it to be, but getting it in play late doesn't feel very good. Like, it's very rarely worth a whole card when you top deck this late and play it or something like that, and that certainly hurts its value. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Pegasus Guardian, which for 5 generic and a white is a 3/3 Pegasus at uncommon, and it has an adventure called Rescue the Foal, which for 1 generic and a white is an instant that exiles target creature you control, then returns that card to the battlefield under its owner's control, and it has flying when it's a creature, and at the beginning of your instep, if a permanent you controlled left the battlefield this turn, you make a 1/1 white Pegasus creature token with flying. So this has a pretty cool design. Like I've been saying in this video, I don't love cards that just blink or flicker things. I need them to do something else, and this card finally delivers there. You can use the Rescue the Foal effect early to get another trigger from an Enter the Battlefield ability to save a creature from removal and so forth, and when you have that attached to a card that is a real card later in the game, it feels a heck of a lot better, and that's certainly what you have here. A 6-mana 3/3 flyer isn't the best stat line we've ever seen, but this card gives you a big payoff for creatures leaving the battlefield because you get a 1/1 Pegasus at the beginning of your instep if that has happened, and you can wait to cast this until it's already happened, and thus you're actually paying 6 for a 3/3 flyer and a 1/1 flyer, which feels pretty good. And then obviously it can keep cycling, and maybe you got value out of the first half. Basically, this card enables these blue-white and black-white decks that are interested in things leaving the battlefield or rebuying into the battlefield abilities, and then it's also a payoff. And for me, that makes it really key for those decks in a way that a lot of these other cards I've been down on just aren't, because they don't do enough when you're not actually abusing those sorts of things, whereas Pegasus Guardian gives you an enabler and a payoff, and I think that's really good. I do think the stat line is ugly enough that I don't love going after this with like a first pick. I could see that changing. If this format is grindy and enough about value, it'll get better. But for now, I think it's probably just a C+. Next up, we've got Portable Hull, which for 1 white mana is an uncommon artifact. When it enters the battlefield, you exile target non-land permanent opponent controls with a mana value 2 or less until Portable Hull leaves the battlefield. So another reprint, and it was pretty mediocre last time. You can definitely play this in your white decks and you won't feel horrible about it, but there will be some games where you don't have good targets for this. Your typical limited deck will probably have like 4 to 5 things it can hit, and that's often not enough. I think this is a C-. Next up, we've got Priest of Ancient Lore, which for 2 generic and a white is a 2/1 dwarf cleric at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you gain 1 life and draw a card. Another Forgotten Realms reprint, and it was white's best common in that set, and I think that's going to be true here too. It will give you a lot of 2-for-1s, and it gains you life, which the green-white deck is extra interested in. Sure, it doesn't have flying like Inspiring Overseer, and if you've played Capenna and you're experienced with that card, but that card was absurd. This one is merely a very, very good common instead of a format warping one. And it might actually be better here than it was in Forgotten Realms, as I feel like it will be easier to rebuy into the battlefield abilities in this format. This is a great common, I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Rally Maneuver, which for 2 generic and a white is an uncommon instant. Target creature gets +2/+0 and gains first strike until end of turn. Up to 1 other target creature gets +0/+2 and gains lifelink until end of turn. I had kind of high hopes for this card in Forgotten Realms. It does have 2-for-1 potential, but you'll be surprised how hard it is to actually line up 2 creatures that can both survive combat thanks to this card. And, paying 3 for a trick is always a little bit brutal. You want to be paying 1 or 2 for most tricks so that you can get the most tempo possible, so that if your opponent responds in some way, you're not utterly destroyed. And that is pretty much what happens here. I wasn't impressed with this in Forgotten Realms, and I don't really see that changing in this format either. I think it's a D. Next up, it's Rescuer Chwinga, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/2 elemental spirit at uncommon. It's got flash, and when it enters the battlefield, you may return another permanent you control to its owner's hand. So, like I said earlier, a 2-mana 2/2 with flash is already playable, and like the other card we talked about, this has an extra ability that really matters sometimes. You can use this to save a permanent from removal, or you can use it to rebuy and enter the battlefield ability. You won't always be able to do something with it, but it does have synergy with one of the archetypes in the format, and it's like a decent card in a vacuum anyway. I think it's a C+. Next up, it's Scouting Hawk, which for 2 generic and a white is a 1/1 bird. At uncommon, it's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, if an opponent controls more lands than you, search your library for a basic plains card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. So this is a really weird card because the times where you get the plains, it's going to feel like a very good card. Like you just played a 3-mana 1/1 flyer that not only got you a card, but also ramped your mana, okay? That's going to feel really good. But you know what's not going to feel really good? When you play this and you don't get that enter the battlefield trigger to do something. And that's going to happen a significant chunk of the time. Now, if you're going second, it's pretty easy to set up Scouting Hawk in such a way that you do get the land. But if you're going first, it's really not worth limiting your development just so you can get a plains with this most of the time. And so this is just a strange card in terms of how we evaluate it. I almost wish they'd given it some sort of additional effect, like if you can't search up the land, like, I don't know, give it lifelink, you know, something small. It can't be something too big, but I wish they'd done something like that so it would be a better card. Because, yeah, it's going to feel, like I said, really good when you get the land. And when you don't, you have an abysmal 3-mana 1/1 flyer. So I think you kind of split the difference between the two modes, which are like a D-, maybe even an F, and like a B. And where you end up is a C. Next up, it's Steadfast Paladin, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/2 Dwarf Knight at common with lifelink. So another reprint, not a particularly interesting one, but it was solid in Forgotten Realms because lifelink was a thing. I mean, life gain as an archetype was a thing, and you had a decent creature in a vacuum anyway. I think it's a C. Next up, it's Steadfast Unicorn, which for 1 white mana is a 1/2 unicorn at common. Creatures you control get +1/+1 and gain vigilance until end of turn. Activate only during your turn. You have to pay 3 generic and a white for that. So we've seen a lot of 1-drops over the years that have like a mass pump effect, and most of them have been pretty underwhelming. You know, you play them early. They aren't that great early. Like, this is not going to be able to attack after turn 2 most of the time. And then, yeah, in the late game, you can use the ability, but it usually means that you're not adding to your board, and all of that is a problem. But it's a pretty real mana sink ability, and the fact that this adds vigilance to the mass pump effect is pretty real. Being able to attack with your whole board and then keep everything back as blockers too is often enough to really alter races. Now, I'm not saying this is great or anything, but I think it's better than most versions of this card we've seen in the past. I think it's like a C. Next up, it's Stick Together, which for 3 generic and 2 white is a rare sorcery, and it says each player chooses a party from among creatures they control, then sacrifices the rest. And as a reminder text tells you to choose a party, each player chooses up to 1 each of cleric, rogue, warrior, and wizard. This is weird, and it's probably a little bit too wacky of a wrath effect. Sure, you'll frequently be able to hold on to some of your stuff, and you'll be able to build your deck so that it's better with Stick Together, but your opponent's going to have creatures with these types too, and you don't have enough control over how this is going to go. Sometimes this will be really good for you. It will kill your opponent's whole board, and you'll keep like 2 creatures. Other times, you want to have enough creatures to save and your opponent has more than you do, so casting this is actually better for your opponent than it is for you. And I just think this card, it has such a wild range, and I think far too often it's not going to do enough to either help you win the game or it will in fact help your opponent, that the times where you want to play this are pretty low, and I think that makes it an F. Next up, it's You Hear Something on Watch, which for 1 generic and a white is a common instant, and it has 2 options. You can give all of your creatures +1/+1 till end of turn, or you can do 5 damage to an attacking creature. So this was a decent card in Forgotten Realms Limited. Being able to kill a whole lot of attacking creatures in the format for 2 mana isn't a bad deal, even if it can be a little situational. And that's the mode you're going to use the most here. And sometimes pumping your whole board's good too. I don't usually think you want more than like 1 of these, but I do like the first copy a reasonable amount, giving it a C+. Next up, it's You're Ambushed on the Road, which for 1 white mana is a common instant, and it says choose 1, return target creature you control to its owner's hand, or target creature gets +1/+3 until end of turn. So This wasn't very good in Forgotten Realms. It's tempting to look at a card like this and think of all the ways you can use these two modes, but too often, neither of these modes is actually worth a card. Now, this format does have more reasons to return your stuff to your hand than most, but I don't think that makes it much better than it was in Forgotten Realms, giving it a D. Next up, it's You're Confronted by Robbers, which for 3 generic and a white is an uncommon instant, and it says choose one, tap up to 3 target creatures, or create 3 1/1 white soldier creature tokens. This looks pretty good. Neither mode is great for the investment, but 3 1/1 soldiers at instant speed for 4 mana is enough for this card to be like a C at worst. You can use those bodies to ambush block stuff, or they can help you go wide if you're interested in doing that. What's nice is, if you already are wide enough, you can use this to tap down blockers at the end of your opponent's turn and go for the win. So it sort of has 2 modes. One you can use when you need more creatures, one you can use to help you do lethal damage. I think this is a C+. So our last few cards in this video are all cards with Specialize, and this is one of the new mechanics in the set, and it's a pretty interesting one, and also a fairly convoluted one. So here's the first of these. Clement, Novice, Acolyte. For 1 generic and a white, you get a 2/2 legendary tiefling cleric. At rare, it has Specialize 2, and when it enters the battlefield, creature cards in your hand perpetually get +1/+1. So Specialize, what that means is you can pay 2 generic mana and discard a card. Then Clement becomes one of these 5 creatures you see to the right of Clement here. If you discard a plains or a white card, it becomes Clement Life Acolyte, a 3/3 with lifelink, and when it specializes, you get a boon with, when you cast your next creature spell, that creature enters the battlefield with a lifelink counter on it. If you discard an island or you discard a blue card, Clement becomes Clement Knowledge Acolyte, a 3/4 with Vigilance, and when it specializes, you seek 3 non-land permanent cards, choose one of those cards, and shuffle the rest of your library. If you discard a swamp or a black card, it becomes Clement Death Acolyte, which is a 3/3, and when it specializes, you get 2 2/2 black zombie creature tokens. If you discard a mountain or a red card, you get Clement Tempest Acolyte, which is a 2/3 with double strike, and whenever it's dealt damage, it deals that much damage to any target. And if you discard a forest or a green card, it becomes Clement Nature Acolyte, a 4/4 that when it leaves the battlefield gives you a 4/4 green ox creature token. So that's a lot of different modes, but the short version here is they're all really good. So if you play this on turn 2, even before it ever specializes, the boost it gives to your hand will have a big impact on the game. Sometimes you'll get to a point in the game where that doesn't do a whole lot, like, you know, if you top deck this late or whatever, but most of the time it will buff at least one thing in your hand. And then all the different specialized versions are quite powerful. Unsurprisingly, the white one is probably the least impressive, probably because that's the easiest thing to have with it. But all of the other ones are really good. You know, Clement Knowledge Acolyte effectively draws you a card from among 3 cards that you get to choose. Clement Death Acolyte suddenly gives you 2/2 zombies on the table. Clement Tempest Acolyte comes with double strike and makes it hard. You know, if it's damaged in any way, you get to damage something else. And the Nature Acolyte leaves behind a 4/4. They're all really good. I think that the 2 best ones are probably the blue one and the black one, but frankly, you'll shove this in any white deck and it will turn into one of these things, and that will feel really good. So yeah, you give up a card, right, because you're specializing, but what you get is definitely worth a card for the most part. This is especially true if you're discarding a land. That's one thing that I think really pumps these up. If you had to discard a card that was one of these colors, they wouldn't be quite as good. But being able to discard a land and turn one of these into one of these more powerful creatures is pretty good. And Clement also benefits from the fact that before you ever think about Specialize at all, it's a powerful 2-drop. This is a bomb, I'm giving it an A. All right, our next specialized card is Lae'zel, Githyanki Warrior, which for 3 generic and a white is a 2/4 Gith Warrior at rare. She's got double strike, specialized for only 1 mana, and whenever you cast it, it gains. When this creature becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, you may exile this creature, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. And when it specializes, the white version is a 3/6 with double strike, and when it enters the battlefield or specializes, you get to seek a non-land permanent card with mana value 3 or less. The blue version is a 3/6 with double strike, and when it enters the battlefield or specializes, you conjure a duplicate of a random creature card from an opponent's library into your hand. It perpetually gains. You may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast this spell. The black version is a 3/6 with double strike, and when it enters the battlefield or specializes, you return up to 2 target creature cards with total mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. The The red version is a 3/6 with double strike, and when it enters the battlefield or specializes, you get 2 1/1 white soldier creature tokens. And the green version is a 3/6 with double strike, and whenever it enters the battlefield or specializes, other creatures you control and creature cards in your hand perpetually get +1/+1. So again, the front side here is a very good card. A 4 mana 2/4 with double strike that dodges the first removal spell that's pointed at it is great. Then this can specialize for only 1 mana, and when it does, all of the effects really make up for the card that you discard, and then some, I think, in some cases. One really cool thing is, if you manage to transform this before it is ever targeted by removal, you actually get an enter the battlefield trigger when your opponent tries to remove it, and it blinks itself. Yeah, I mean, this is another one that's just a bomb. It just gives you a ton of value. I don't care that I have to discard a card and pay 1 mana when what I get out of the card is basically always a full card worth of value and then some. It's an A. Next, it's Lulu, Forgetful Hollyphant, which for 2 generic into white is a 1/3 elephant angel at uncommon. It's got flying, it's got specialized too, and when it enters the battlefield, you get a boon with, when you cast your next creature spell without flying, it perpetually gains flying. The white version of Lulu is a 2/4 flyer, and whenever you attack with 1 or more other creatures with flying, you gain twice that much life. The blue version is also a 2/4 flyer. They're all 2/4 flyers in this case, so we'll streamline this. Whenever you attack with 1 or more other creatures with flying, draw that many cards and discard a card. The black version says whenever you attack with 1 or more other creatures with flying, each opponent loses that much life and you gain that much life. The red one says whenever you attack with 1 or more other creatures with flying, create that many 1/1 white soldier creature tokens that are tapped and attacking. And the green one says whenever you attack with 1 or more other creatures with flying, those creatures get +2/+2 until end of turn. So you're seeing that all these specialized cards are pretty pushed, and that's even true of this uncommon one. This is another one where the front side is a very nice card. A 3 mana 1/3 flyer that gives flying to the next creature you cast would be a card that I'd give a B- at worst. And then this can transform into all these other versions of itself that give you more value for attacking with flyers, which generally, you'll have 2 of those because you've got Lulu and something else, and you can also combine it with other flyers to be really formidable as well. It doesn't have to be Lulu and the thing it gives flying to. I think this is an uncommon that gets pretty close to being a bomb. I'm going to give it a B+, and I wouldn't be too shocked if it ends up higher than that. And our last white card and the last specialized card is Rasad, Monk of Saloon, which for 2 generic into white is a 2/2 legendary human monk at uncommon. Its specializes 5, which is pretty high compared to what we've seen so far. And when it enters the battlefield, you exile target creature an opponent controls until this creature leaves the battlefield. So this is a Banisher Priest type creature, and that's always great in Limited. The downside is, of course, that your opponent can find removal and get their thing back, but you usually still took their creature for a few turns. The good news is that Rasad can specialize into a larger creature, making it first harder to kill, and then all of them also give you an effect that helps you soften the blow if your opponent does get rid of him, which I guess I forgot to read, but the white version of Rasad, they're all 4/4s in this case, the white version of Rasad makes it so the creature that you exiled is forever a 1/1 with no abilities. The blue version, when it dies, you get 2 1/1 flyers. The black version, when it dies, you get a 4/1 skeleton with menace. The red version, when it dies, gives you 3 1/1 white soldier creature tokens. And the green version, when it dies, gives you 2 2/2 boar creature tokens. So that's nice. It makes it so that if your opponent does ever actually manage to get their creature back, you get something back, or in the case of the white version, the creature they get back isn't that impressive. Specialized 5 is really high, but the fact that this is a Banisher Priest creature on the front helps make up for the fact that this is a little more costly to specialize than most things, and I think it's another B+. So, those are all the white cards in Alchemy Horizons Baldur's Gate. Do you think I underrated or overrated any cards in this video? Let me know in the comments. Tomorrow I'll be back to talk about every blue card in the set. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of this set review and draft videos in the near future, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can by becoming a patron or a YouTube member. You can find those things in the description. Thanks for watching.